I'm not sure how many of you in here were ever made to feel stupid or inadequate when it came to your schooling experiences, but I imagine a few of you in here, myself included, at some point of your schooling experience felt inadequate and not quite smart enough to be successful in school. Scripts in theater are used to dictate to actors and actresses the parts they play and tell them exactly what they're supposed to say. Now, where do these scripts come from? These scripts clearly outline who plays the lead, the supporting roles, and even the villains. And what if scripts were actually played out in our society and in our schools? Or in other words, what if people actually believed that they had certain parts to play based on what they perceived their scripts to be? Folks, this happens every day. And again, where do these scripts come from? We are born with information that gets coded in our brain, that tell us where we are safe and where we are not safe, where we belong and don't belong, whether or not we are better off than someone else, and what is normal or supposed to happen. One of the most significant places where these scripts are formulated is in the school. How do we measure a student's value? We have defined and measured student success over the years by the same clinical and quantitative terms. Why do we do this? Because these are the metrics that are easiest to measure and compare. Now, don't get me wrong, these measurements hold some value. But if we allow these measurements to dictate the schooling experience of all of our students, we have to be prepared for the harsh ways that they reinforce scripts. For some students, the script looks pretty good, and for others, not so much. For some students, they are achievers, they're winners, they're heroes and heroines in the story. But what about those who historically have not had the leading roles, or whose parents have not held the leading roles? What can we do to flip their scripts and provide opportunities for such students to become the authors of their own stories? Through my research, I propose 3 areas of focus that have demonstrated over and over again how we can flip the script for our most underserved students. Authenticity, a focus on recognizing and validating the unique identities students bring to the classroom. Relevance, or the relevance of the course content and material to the student's life, both current and future. And then meaningful connections with peers, mentors, and the community. Let me illustrate how I arrived at these 3 emphases. A number of years ago, I had an opportunity to teach Introduction to Public Speaking class, all right? How many of you in here have ever taken an Intro to Public Speaking course? Wonderful, then you might feel some of the pain that I'm about to talk about. As students delivered their speeches throughout the semester, I graded them on the following 20 techniques. Take a look at those techniques as you see them pop up there. Again, I'm not sure if this is intimidating to anybody, but how would you like to take that class? What I noticed is something troubling, though. I noticed that my Navajo students, my Latina and Latino students, and my international students weren't finding success according to my sort of very Aristotelian rubric for grading, or what I had deemed to be valuable public speaking. Some students reported that because of their linguistic and cultural backgrounds, they would never grasp some of the methods that I was teaching that were supposedly great or necessary for public speaking. I asked my department chair at the time, Dr. Janet Colvin, if we could try something new, and she agreed, so we did. Here was the setup. We created a bilingual section of the class, 18 students enrolled, 14 Latina and Latino students and 4 Navajo students. For their introductory speech, I told them they could deliver the speech in whatever language they wanted to. Many chose Spanish, some English, one in Navajo. We then had them do a testimonial about their background and heritage with visual aids. As we reviewed the tapes of the class sessions, Dr. Colvin and I recognized something. The students were employing the very characteristics of what they considered to be strong public speaking, but only after they were able to find their voice of comfort. Be in control of the environment that made sense to them, and speak about topics they cared about. For their final 2 speeches, the persuasive and the informative speeches, we decided to partner up with 2 elementary schools and 2 middle schools. We selected schools with a significant percentage of Latino and Native American students. I divided the class into 4 teams, 1 for each of the schools, and on a designated day, each team went to their partner school, and in a small assembly-style format, they each took turns delivering their informative speeches. About what? About their majors at UVU. The speeches were primarily in English, but many students also used Spanish and Navajo. They used it in moments of their speeches. After the first speech in the schools, the students debriefed in teams and then began preparing for their persuasive speeches, focusing on persuading the younger students to go to college. My students rotated and visited one of the other 4 schools and once again delivered speeches in English, Spanish, and Navajo, persuading the young students to prepare for and eventually enroll in college. The speeches, folks, were filled with passion and emotion. The partner teachers were so excited that for the first time they had Latino and Native American role models in their schools. The K-12 students reported and they expressed gratitude to have the impact of these speeches in their schools from our students. And my students, well, they learned that through the public speaking format, they have the power to influence and move people. And more importantly, they saw the impact of sharing their stories. My students reported for the first time in their schooling experience that they were valued for their bilingualism and heritage. They saw the power and relevancy of the content or skill development material, and the class became meaningful to them. And they valued the influence of peers, cohort-based learning, team projects, and roles as mentors. You see, at first, I was so focused on teaching students to develop the skills necessary to speak in public. What I missed was that the students needed first to find their authentic voice and then be provided the opportunity to deliver their authentic voice to an authentic audience. The relevance of the skill development was more important than the components of the skill development. By focusing on authenticity, relevance, and connection, we were able to help students flip their scripts when it came to their abilities and impact as public speakers. The second example comes from my background as an artist. I've been doing art-related activities since I can remember, primarily because of my artist father. Some activities included watercolor, graphite, graphic design, and I'm sure like many of you in here, graffiti. This is a piece I did recently. I'm not sure if you can see what it says. I'll give you a second. When I do this with youth audiences, immediately they can call it out. Usually in audiences like this, a few people turn to their neighbor and, I swear I see an S there somewhere. It says justice. Now again, due to the technology, I'm not sure if it allows me to, but if I flip this over, it still says justice. I did this piece as part of a project called Hidden Voices Graffiti here at UVU. Let me elaborate. I had the opportunity to work with a gang prevention task force locally. I worked with Tony Castillo and Koki Klein to see if we might reframe opportunities for education among young artists who had dropped out of high school and or had juvenile records for their graffiti work. I also worked with the curator of our Woodbury Museum of Art, Melissa Hempel. We wanted to create a space that would simultaneously validate young street writers as artists and also provoke a community conversation about what counted as art or what was museum worthy. All of us involved in the project were tired of listening to the deficit discourses that framed these young people as bad people that needed to be locked up. These attitudes from authority figures, community members, and especially educators took their toll on how the young artists perceive themselves. At our first meeting with the artists, we had a powerful 90-minute conversation about why we write. Some said they didn't fit in at school and they didn't feel valued at home. Others said they felt silenced because everyone assumed that they were stupid or troublemakers. One artist discussed that the only way he felt he could be heard or have an impact on the world around him was through writing, street writing, or what you would call tagging. In other words, in their scripts, they took on some pretty negative and outcast roles, even in the very schooling spaces where all students should feel a sense of belonging. Their voices were undervalued, they were hidden, and far too often they were forbidden. And you could see that first night through the dialogue how important it was for us to share stories. Over the next 4 months, our artists met at various locations to do sessions with a few faculty mentors. The canvases and spray cans were donated by local companies. Our faculty mentors not only worked with the artists in terms of concept and production of art, but helped the young men think through who they were and who they wanted to be as artists. The mentors also talked about college, financial aid, careers in art, and more. In the fall, the artists produced new pieces for the exhibit as well as artist statements around the topic of hidden voices. By November, the boys had finished their pieces and were working with Melissa to prep the museum, as you can see here. They chose the colors, lighting, displays, and worked on a mini documentary. They designed and distributed the flyers, and they took ownership of the museum exhibit. Folks, it was beautiful. Before we opened the doors the first night, we held a dinner for the artists and their families. I spoke to the families that night and told them to be proud of the work of their sons, brothers, nephews, uncles, cousins. I then spoke to the artists and told them to be proud of their work, to stand proudly next to their work, and when people asked them about their work, to tell them what inspired them. I finally told the whole group, if only a few people come tonight, you still need to be proud of what's happened here. It's still a success. Well, we opened the doors, and a few people trickled in. The boys were somewhat nervous at first, but found their comfort in discussing their work with people. This slide here is of an artist doing his first major piece, while other artists had produced some seasoned work. This particular piece depicts an angelic and demonic treatment of the word graffiti. It reflects the artist's feeling of being torn between his artistic sensibilities and an art form that was not widely accepted as art. This next piece of Serenity was produced by another artist who wrote his street name 100 times and then came over the top of it with some sort of harmonious or angelic depiction, saying that he is going to leave the chaos of his past life now that he had found his voice through education. Folks, this is powerful stuff. Perhaps the most significant influences of the evening was on the younger siblings, nieces, and nephews who for the first time saw their brothers and uncles being celebrated for their artistic abilities rather than being condemned for at-risk behavior. This was a night about flipping scripts for the artists, their families, and the community. And folks, the community, boy, did they show up. By the end of the night, 540 people had attended and walked through the 3 galleries. We had a mini program where President Holland presented each of the artists with acceptance letters to UVU and admitted 2 to the honors program with scholarships. The artists were validated in their identities as artists. They saw the value and impact of their work on people, and they developed a strong cohort of learners and mentors. When educators focus on authenticity, relevance, and connection, the schooling experience becomes meaningful and the script becomes a positive one. I believe that a student's capacity to succeed in the classroom is influenced by his or her ability, to make connections with the classroom environment, content, and people. So how do we make this happen? How do we utilize the ARC approach when we're trying to flip the script? Let me share just a few suggestions that we can not only utilize in the schools, but I would argue in the workplace and even within the home. First, authenticity. We must recognize the inherent strengths and richness of every student that walks into our classroom. Students have stories and names. Learn them both. One Hidden Voices mentor explained that he wasn't trying to change the artists, but rather wanted to build on what they already had, but he had to get to know them first. We need to recognize that students need to be invited to share their stories as part of the learning process. Let us create environments where students and our youth can flourish because of who they are, not in spite of who they are. Next, relevance. We as educators all have our nerd zones, okay? We get into these zones and expect everybody else to love our subjects. Students need to see how the material connects with their world. Let us engage students in real-life challenges and scenarios, including community-based learning. Let us cultivate within the students a passion of learning by getting passionate ourselves about teaching and sharing. Let us answer the so what question whenever a new concept is discussed, as my good colleague, Dr. Brian Waite, always invites us to do. Let us find projects and capstones that lead to meaningful deliverables in the home and in the school. Let us create opportunities for students to take ownership of their learning. And finally, connection. Educators need to create opportunities for students to connect through learning communities, peer and faculty mentoring, group reflection, and community engagement. Over the past 12 years, I've asked hundreds of students, community members, and educators about the factors that led to their success. And folks, without fail, every person recalled a parent, mentor, community or church leader, friend, and especially a teacher as the primary reason for their success. The concepts of the ARC approach are not new, but how much are they a part of our everyday discussions in schools? Far too often in education, the tail is wagging the dog. Or in other words, these metrics force educators to teach students as if they're a part of a factory. Just as scholars before have said we need to employ more culturally relevant teaching, I am calling for us to recenter the education process on the students and not the tests. Ladies and gentlemen, let us remember our own schooling experiences. Each of you in this room can remember the folks that have impacted your lives. I know I can. We revere these educators not because of a particular lesson they taught or because they were simply brilliant. We revere them because of how much they cared about us and how much we perceived that they cared about us. We look up to them. Why? Because they were the ones who invited us to get into their nerd zones and be inspired and had us consider our interests anew because of their passion and because of the relevancy of the material to our world. These are the ones who stayed after class. These were the ones who listened to us, the ones who checked up on us when we were sick, the ones who mentored us toward a better future. These were the educators who understand authenticity, relevance, and connection when trying to provide new scripts and opportunities for students to rethink and reframe where they are in this world. These are the educators that I want to be like. Thank you.